All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Taylor, and I'm a program officer with Hillman Family Foundations. Based in Pittsburgh, our organization supports the philanthropic and civic work of multiple generations of Hillman family members through 18 individual foundations. The largest of these, the Henry L. Hillman Foundation, is inspired by its namesake, the late Henry Hillman, who prioritized investments that were forward-looking, collaborative, timely, and strategically positioned to provide the most benefit to the residents of southwestern Pennsylvania, exactly like all the work that's being discussed today to prepare for a historic federal investment in enhancing broadband connectivity and promoting digital equity. Over the last few years, I've had the pleasure of working with SPC and several others present here today to support efforts to systematically and equitably address the digital divide across our region. As part of our sustainable regional infrastructure portfolio, which includes over a dozen interrelated grants in the last few years, the Henry L. Hillman Foundation has provided $1 million in funding to support the development of the connectivity roadmap and the next steps in its implementation. However, our collective work here is just a piece of what's happening at the state level and the federal level, which is why I'm so pleased to introduce today's keynote speaker, Ms. Anna Reed, to give us a broader look at what is happening nationally. Anna Reed is the Senior Officer at the Broadband Access Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts, leading Pew's efforts to examine how states and the federal government are working to connect millions of Americans to affordable, high-speed, reliable internet. Her work focuses on research that will help legislators and other policymakers expand connectivity and close the digital divide. Before joining Pew, she was at the American Planning Association and also worked on regional broadband planning efforts for Missouri's Office of Administration and for the International City-County Management Association. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Bryn Mawr College and a master's degree in regional planning from Cornell University. Please join me in welcoming Anna Reed.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today and for letting me interrupt your lunch with some remarks. I am not quite sure where the clicker for the slides is, but while we're figuring that out, I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to Pew. We are also a Pennsylvania-based foundation. Our headquarters is in Philadelphia, and we were founded in 1948. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization focused on complex policy challenges. And over the last few years, one of the policy areas we've been focused on is broadband. Specifically, we've been looking at the role that states play in expanding broadband access, and we've done research across all 50 states to better understand both the policy landscape and what states are doing programmatically. This is a very exciting moment with the amount of funding that's available. When we started looking at state programs a few years ago, prior to the pandemic, we were looking at programs that had $5, $10, $15 million a year. And now with the federal funding, we're looking at, as was mentioned, hundreds of millions of dollars for some states, nearly $1 billion, possibly over $1 billion in funding. So with that, we're at this moment where we know that broadband is a necessity. It's really been very well established. And the question is, how do we make sure that people have access, the access that they need to high-speed, affordable, reliable internet? The challenges to broadband access and adoption are complex. I'm trying to change the slide. Sorry. There we go. I think there's just a little delay, so now I know. Are complex, and we're at, again, this moment where closing gaps, the need to close these gaps in access is recognized, and we have a lot of funding available through the American Rescue Plan Act and through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And this funding is looking not just at investing in infrastructure, but also in those challenges of adoption, affordability, and digital skills. And that's a really important shift in broadband policy in this moment in broadband policy, is that more holistic look at thinking about these issues not sequentially, not independently, but holistically in order to maximize investments in broadband. So I wanted to there we go, highlight the work that you have done in this region and the importance of laying the groundwork for this funding in this moment. On the first panel, Andy mentioned the depth of the regional efforts and that being unique, and it really is. I've looked at a lot of regional plans for broadband across the country, and the way that it has been approached in this region and the clear link to the outcome that you're looking to achieve with that. It's not just broadband access, but it is that investment in building an equitable and economically vibrant region. And then also with that, just emphasizing as well the work that's been done on the Pennsylvania statewide broadband plan and the position that that creates for the state going into the 5-year planning process for the BEAD funding that was mentioned. And again, the emphasis on that outcome of creating an economically competitive Commonwealth. So the challenges that these plans identify related to infrastructure adoption and digital equity are not unique. These are the same challenges we see, nationally. However, the specifics of these challenges vary across states and regions. And I think on one of the earlier panels, someone said it was a big problem with local solutions, and I think that's a great description of what we're looking at. So I wanted to see why there was such an effort to change the slides earlier. What this challenge looks like, right, across the country. And so we know that it's not just one challenge, right? It's those challenges of infrastructure, access to infrastructure, of adoption and affordability, and of digital skills, and the ability to make use of that connection. And we need to look at each of these pieces independently, but again, also holistically, right? We can't separate them completely. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the infrastructure challenge. And this is where the bulk of funding has gone and where the bulk of funding will continue to go. It's the most expensive part of the problem, and it's where we really do see that urban-rural divide in terms of what is available. So according to the most recent FCC maps, which I know everyone has probably formed an opinion of at this point, there are about 13 million un- and underconnected locations, broadband serviceable locations nationwide. The Pennsylvania Broadband Plan estimates that there are about 400,000 in the state of Pennsylvania. And issues with the map aside, one of the big important pieces with the infrastructure access challenge is understanding where those locations are, because where they are and sort of how they're grouped does impact, the solutions to those challenges. But we've talked a lot about unserved and underserved, and we haven't really defined them today. So I did want to take a moment to highlight that based on the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment BEAD program, unserved is those locations that do not have service at speeds of 25 megabits per second in the download direction, 3 megabits per second in the upload direction. This is how the FCC currently defines broadband. But if you look at their household usage guide, this is what they estimate a household with 1 or 2 devices would need primarily for basic functions such as web browsing or using it only for email, and the use of one advanced application such as streaming video or web conferencing. So I think many people would recognize that as below the usage needs of an average household. When we talk about underserved, that's below speeds of 100 megabits per second in the download direction, 20 megabits per second in the upload direction. This is what the FCC estimates is needed for households with more than one device that need to use more than one of those advanced applications at a time. But to kind of further contextualize these numbers, I wanted to highlight that Ookla, the speed testing service, has a set of global averages, and they estimate that the average download speed in the US is now 192 megabits per second. The average upload speed is now 22 megabits per second. So where broadband service is available, it is available to consumers at speeds well above even that underserved threshold. And then when we think about infrastructure, when we're talking about infrastructure, it's important not to think just about the availability and the speed of that service, but also the quality and the reliability of the service that's provided. So with that, we know that the next challenge is the adoption challenge, which is, there we go, we know that many fewer households subscribe to broadband than have broadband available to them. So even where connections are available, people are not adopting, and we know that affordability is a barrier to adoption. Our colleagues at the Pew Research Center have done significant work on this and have found that while only 8% of households with household incomes over 75,000, adults in households with, sorry, this is a very technical distinction that they like to make sure we make. So adults in households with incomes above $75,000 per year do not have home broadband connection. 43% of those in households with incomes below $30,000 per year lack a home broadband connection. So there's a very clear correlation with income. We also know that this can be a challenge to maintaining a subscription. So during the pandemic, over a third of adults in households with incomes under $30,000 a year reported having difficulty maintaining their connection, making people subscription vulnerable, meaning they may cancel their broadband subscription in order to pay for other household necessities on a monthly basis. And then we know that additionally, unconnected households cite cost-related considerations as the primary reason for non-adoption. Again, our colleagues at the Pew Research Center have looked at this issue. Respondents are able to select more than one reason, but 45% of people indicate that the high monthly cost of a connection is a barrier to having home broadband access. Another 37% cite the cost of a computer. So as a result, low-income households are more likely to be mobile dependent, relying only on a smartphone to connect to the internet, which poses many challenges related to how you're interacting with that connection, what applications you're able to use. So far, we have, this has been very focused on affordability for low-income households, but I wanted to highlight that the BEAD program does require states to have plans for middle-class affordability, and there isn't a clear definition of what this is, right? This is a goal to help ensure that all households have access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. And so we've been looking at this issue a little bit in terms of what does that mean? How can we define that? And so one of the benchmarks or thresholds that is out there is the International Telecommunications Union, UNESCO, Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development, which is a standard of 2% of monthly household income. And this is in line, this type of benchmark is in line with how we think of other household necessities like housing or transportation. And so in that way, it's a good sort of framing of how to think of the impact of broadband service on a monthly budget. Of course, there can be a lot of variation across, obviously, a country, a state, or a region. So we've been trying to break this down a little bit more and look at it at the county and possibly even more granular level. And so this is what it looks like in Pennsylvania. The highest, if you're looking at, again, based on median income, the highest monthly cost that would be affordable would be $173 a month. That's in Chester County. The lowest would be $67 a month in Cameron County. So over $100 in difference between those, right, for what would be affordable to a household with the median income in those counties. In this region, and this is my test to see if I got the right counties up on my table, there isn't quite as much variation as there is statewide, but there's still a $40 range between what would be affordable on a monthly basis to a household at the median income level in the lowest, the county with the lowest median income and the county with the highest median income. And I want to emphasize this again because, you know, when we talk about affordability, and this I think has come up a little bit today, it's often kind of discussed as primarily a problem in areas where service is available, but it is also a challenge in rural and unserved areas. And it's something we need to be considering, and this is what it is and what sustainable solutions for addressing it look like, because it is important to adoption, which is critical to the ongoing success of the networks that are being built with this investment of federal funding. So really wanting to just kind of emphasize that. And then, sorry, sorry, I'm really struggling with the slides here. The next challenge is the digital literacy and digital skills challenge. So ensuring that people do have the skills to make use of the connection. So your statewide broadband plan estimates that about 15% of adults in Pennsylvania lack the necessary digital skills to access and benefit from digital services. So services such as telehealth access, financial services, online education, which are all critically important, especially at a time when research shows the share of jobs that require some level of digital skills is increasing. So now that we've gone over the challenges, the federal broadband funding really presents an opportunity for the solutions. And I wanted to note, we've heard this called a once-in-a-generation investment. We've heard it called a historic amount of funding. I worked for a state broadband program during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was talked about as a historic amount of funding at that time. It was $7.8 billion total. So again, I just wanted to kind of emphasize the scale of that funding in comparison to the last major investment in addressing not through the FCC, investing addressing broadband funding. So I know the last panel covered a number of the programs available in depth, but I really just want to go through some of these quickly and highlight the opportunities that are available. And one of the things I also want to highlight is that across the different federal programs, there are differing requirements, and they sometimes have different, though often overlapping, priorities. And so going back to a point that was made on the previous panel, ensuring that as you're thinking about projects, as you're thinking about opportunities, which funding source is the best. But these are, with the exception of the Middle Mile program, I'm just going to cover funding that is going to states. So the BEAD program, of course, is $42.45 billion. Every state will receive a minimum of $100 million, with the rest allocated by that formula using the unserved locations on the broadband data maps. Pennsylvania's estimate is above $1 billion, so a very significant amount of funding towards this issue. The Digital Equity Act programs, the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program is already underway. That was a formula allocation to states, and Pennsylvania received $1.6 million. So again, a fairly significant investment in digital equity programs. And then I want to, again, just highlight the timeline. I know this was talked about, so I'll skip over it, but or I won't spend too much time on it. We're looking at states getting started on that 5-year planning process towards those initial proposals, and then the allocation of funding will follow that, which makes the American Rescue Plan Act programs particularly significant right now, right? This is funding that is available, and not only is it available, it has a timeline on it that is in advance of that BEAD timeline. So there are two funds here: the Capital Projects Fund, which is a $10 billion formula allocation to states. Pennsylvania allocated all of its $279 billion to broadband, as was covered on the previous panel. And this funding, it's not exclusive to broadband, but it is with a priority on broadband. It has to be allocated by the end of 2024 and expended by the end of 2026. So again, thinking of that in combination with the BEAD timelines. And then the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which is, again, flexible formula funding to states and localities. A number of states across the country allocated some portion of their ARPA funding to broadband grant programs. I know some of the local efforts using ARPA funding were mentioned earlier as well. But what I really do want to highlight with the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund is that localities can contribute this funding as match for the BEAD funds. And so that's something to consider in the planning and to ensure that it's something that, as you look at the full landscape of available federal funds, is being considered. So with the federal funding, and going back to what we've been working on at Pew over the last few years, if I can get my slide to advance, related to state programs. Advancing too much. So every state now has a broadband program of some sort. They live in different places. Some of them have been around for quite a long time. Most of them are relatively new. So prior to the pandemic, really around 2018, we started to see an increase in the number of states with broadband programs. That really accelerated with the availability of the coronavirus relief funds through the CARES Act, and now with the requirement that's, the role of states is the administering entity for the BEAD fund. Every state now has something. The reason Maine looks a little odd on the map is because they have established a quasi-governmental entity as their state broadband office rather than something within state government. So the other thing we see happening right now with state broadband offices is really an increase in the amount of the number of staff dedicated to broadband. So when we were looking at this before the pandemic, most states had, one or two people. We talked to North Carolina at the time. They had 9 people in their office, and that was a huge broadband office. Wisconsin, for example, their office has been around since 2013. They had 4 people when we talked to them prior to the pandemic. They now have 4 times that many in their office. So we're also seeing then more specialization in the roles of the staff in these state broadband offices, right? So we're seeing people focus specifically on the digital equity efforts. We're seeing people focus specifically on the mapping and data collection efforts. And there are other specialized roles depending on some of the state priorities that states are hiring for as well, including legal support. So that's one of the ones that we're starting to see more of. And so we also saw when we looked at states kind of a consistent set of practices in states that had successful broadband efforts. And these really included some of the stuff that you now have to do with the federal funding, like running a grant program, but also the role of that program in being responsive to various stakeholder groups within the state and connecting and playing that sort of role of facilitating connections between communities and ISPs who could partner on grant programs, or in some cases ensuring that people were talking to each other at all. And then also the role in outreach and engagement and supporting local planning and capacity building efforts. So again, and then also the program evaluation role and using that to kind of make changes or move programs forward. So I think that's another just thing that I like to highlight is that a lot of the things that some of those leading states were doing are very clearly reflected now in these federal programs, right? Looking towards those higher speed standards of 120, or with the case of the Capital Project Fund, ARPA funding, 100 symmetrical. Whereas, in some of the early state programs, the unserved definitions were at 10-1 or lower. So that's just kind of where states are. And so with that, I wanted to highlight a few kind of interesting or innovative things we're seeing states do in order to address their specific challenges, as well as prepare for the federal funding. So someday the slide will change. There it goes. So I wanted to first highlight, we see a lot of states kind of, as they're getting to their hardest to serve areas, looking at new forms of partnerships to help close those gaps. And one of the programs that we've done some research on is Virginia's Utility Leverage Program, which essentially focuses on investments that the state's investor-owned utilities are making in their smart grid modernization, and allows them to install excess fiber capacity, which then can be leased to last mile service providers. So it helps address getting that middle mile access, or that lower cost middle mile access, into those unserved communities, where then the last mile service provider is able to build a network, and it helps then also further stretch the state's grant dollars because that middle mile build isn't necessarily necessary in order to facilitate that last mile network. So that's an interesting model that exists in a couple other states as well, including West Virginia and Alabama, and is being explored in a few other states too. Another thing we see is kind of looking at partnerships that model other forms of rural service delivery. So Vermont's communications union districts and Maine's regional utility districts are essentially what like a sewer district or a water district, right? So it's a partnership between multiple municipalities that form a new local government entity, which then owns the underlying infrastructure. There are 2 in Maine, and there are 2 that are up and running in Vermont, but 10 that have formed, covering 213 of the over 200 municipalities in the state. And in general, they operate with a ISP partner who then maintains and operates that network. And so that's been kind of an interesting model that we've seen in rural areas where those states, Maine in particular, has had a long-standing state broadband program in areas where they were having difficulty finding providers to serve that without that sort of public-private partnership of that district. So Washington State also has something similar, leveraging their existing port and public utility districts, which are allowed to provide retail broadband service in rural and unserved areas. So the Port of Seattle is not one of the providers that could do that, but rural port districts throughout the state. And that also has resulted in public-private partnerships where the public utility district or port district owns the underlying infrastructure and works with an ISP partner. So then we're also seeing states look towards more targeted tools to address specific parts of specific needs or challenges that have come up and aren't being solved by their sort of standard last mile grant programs. Sorry, slide's still not changing. Here we go. So one of these, and this was mentioned on the last panel, great to hear that it's something that Pennsylvania is doing, are line extension programs. So those efforts to connect homes that have a very long driveway or a small development that's a little ways from existing service. So several states have created these over the last couple years: Virginia, Indiana, Minnesota, California. So there are a number. And they're all structured slightly differently, but are working to solve that problem of as Brandon said on the previous panel, kind of that low-hanging fruit of those households that are not connected, but are would not be covered by sort of a standard last mile grant program. Minnesota recently created a low-density pilot program, and this is specifically to address areas that it was originally called their high-cost program, high-cost pilot, areas that are higher cost than what were feasible with their standard grant program, which required a 50% match. And so with this program, again, it's still in a pilot phase, the match is a 25% requirement, up to 75% grant funding. And then it also increases the size of the total grant award that can be made. Their border-to-border grant program capped funding at $5 million. This one allows it to go up to 10. And then another interesting thing we see states doing, and this kind of crosses the infrastructure and affordability, digital equity challenges, is looking towards funding for low-income households living in multiple dwelling units. And so where you have house, there can be a variety of challenges there, right? Older buildings that were never wired in the first place, buildings where the service that's available does not necessarily meet the needs of the community that lives there. And so especially with the coronavirus relief funds we've seen, or the ARPA funds, we've seen a couple states allocate funding to this specific challenge. Nevada is putting $55 million towards essentially a fiber to the curb and then either wired or wireless solution within the building in order to bring access to every resident. They're expecting to connect about 40,000 households with that program. Massachusetts is using some of its state and local fiscal recovery funding to pilot a wireless model in public or state subsidized housing. And federally or state subsidized housing. And then California also has had a long-standing program, and they, for publicly supported housing communities and farm worker housing, and are investing in that as well. So a couple different models being used there, but all examples of states looking to address very specific challenges that aren't necessarily addressed by their last mile grant programs. And as was mentioned on the previous panel, if states are able to show that they can reach all their unserved and underserved, there is some flexibility around how how they can use the rest of those funds to address challenges of adoption and affordability. And then finally, I wanted to just emphasize some of the work that states are doing to support local planning efforts and recognize communities that have engaged in efforts to facilitate broadband. And so there are several states now that have broadband ready communities programs. These are kind of a certification or a recognition that localities have taken certain steps in order to facilitate broadband deployment, such as establishing a single point of contact and addressing some of their permitting processes. And so Indiana, Wisconsin, most recently Colorado have these programs. And then we also see a number of states investing more in supporting that local level planning capacity building efforts. Colorado has had a long-standing program through its Department of Local Affairs that has supported regional planning efforts, with a two-phase process, actually. The first phase focused on the broader planning, the second more on the actual feasibility and project implementation. Maine has a program, again, they had a long-standing program and have increased the size of it with their ARPA funding, Connect the Ready, that is based on funding technical and community broadband planning efforts. And then I also wanted to highlight the broadband action teams in Washington State, which are community-driven teams, mostly at the county level, which are focused on identifying and evaluating local broadband challenges and solutions, and being this sort of primary liaison with the state office. And Oregon has now replicated this model. So, this is a very exciting moment for broadband. There's a lot ahead of us still, but there's a lot of opportunity. And it's great to see events like this that are focused on how to make the most of that opportunity. So thank you again, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? Anybody have index cards? Okay, great. Please join me again in thanking Anna for her...
One question,
one back
please.
there. Okay.
Hi, I just was wondering if you could revisit the affordability slide per county. And just for clarification, I wanted to, or is that an average per county? Because some of those counties represent some of the poorest and most affluent households. So I was wondering, if you could explain that slide again, that'd be great.
Sure. So this is something, and we're still trying to kind of figure out how to address that, right? Because if you set a statewide average, if you look at a statewide measure of median household income, especially in particularly wealthy states, that can be a challenge and obscure what actually affordability may be more regionally. And so we haven't quite figured out how to address that specific piece yet, and we're working through looking at that sort of nationwide and talking with states and what some of the considerations around that might be. But what we decided to do sort of for our initial analysis was say, well, if we're looking at this 2% of monthly household income, what does that look like, at a county level nationwide? And then this is obviously Pennsylvania only. and then the table is just regions, this region, but highlighting, that there is a lot of variation, yeah, so that's what this is. And so, again, like if understanding that like the county that's the lowest in the state and the county that are the highest in the state actually probably aren't the most relevant to this analysis, and that they're not necessarily median income households, but still getting sort of a broader view than a statewide average. I hope that was helpful. We're trying to think through, what this middle class affordability question means and what that looks like. Right, yes. So that's kind of the next step, right? Is like understanding if this is what's affordable to a household, then what is the service that is available and how does that compare?
Thank you. If everybody could join me in thanking Anna again. For a very informative presentation. We're going to move to a quick networking break, 10 minutes, and then we're going to reconvene in 10 minutes for our next panel, Digital Equity and Affordability, moderated by Kirsten Compitello. So that is at 1:20. We'll be back together again. Thanks, everyone.